in my work, I focus a lot on the economic, social, environmental implications of transitioning towards low-carbon societies. But what I'm interested in doing tonight is considering a more pragmatic question, and what would it take to finance this transition? All right, so maybe the first question and starting point is to look at why would we need this transition in the first place. And here's a table, a very busy table and very ambitious table. It's looking at our footprint as human societies over the past 12,000 years on the planet. But maybe what's more striking is what's in the corner here just above the spotlight. And what this is suggesting is that maybe we've started to use resources at a rate that's exceeding the carrying capacity of our host planet. So here's maybe put in a simpler way and a simpler diagram, but this is the same notion of ecological footprint and the fact that different countries use it in different ways, but we get to the same conclusion. And some scholars, some people might say this notion of ecological footprint is a bit problematic because we're putting a lot of information into one metric, and that's right. And we're not even quite sure what we mean by being more sustainable and sustainability per se, and that's also correct. But I think when you look at all this information that we have, the bottom line is that, give or take one planet, we're at a stage where our use of resources is truly unsustainable. So maybe a question to ask is, should we care? After all, if we get out of the door outside and we look around, and we're not going to see necessarily a lot of signs of this, right, in the immediate short run, right? So the best answer I found to this question is a quote from a British geoscientist who was recently interviewed in the Guardian newspaper, the British newspaper. And he said, look, if we think that human societies are going to end in 2100, just short of the 22nd century, then we're doing okay, all right? We're doing fine. But if we're a little more optimistic and would like for this human adventure to continue past 2100, well into the 22nd century for the sake of our great-grandchildren, future generations, and their well-being, then we have to kind of start being concerned about some of these more global issues. And so certainly some of what we see, the current economic, social, political tensions are going to continue to intensify. We are going to have to find ways to deal with more extreme weather events. We are going to start to see the ecological, economic implications of resource exhaustion and continue to see growing inequality. We're going to continue to see a significant movement of migration, and at the moment we're not doing so well with those current issues. So it's important to tackle those. What I want to do for the next few minutes is focus on one of those symptoms of our unsustainability, and that's, of course, climate change. And to guide us through this discussion, I want to use the work of a Japanese scientist, Yoichi Kaya, who developed an identity. So here's a picture of Professor Kaya. And he tells us, so if we look at carbon dioxide emissions from human activities, the industrial process, all right, which are largely contributing to this global warming and climate change, we can look at it as the result of four factors, four variables. The first one is population. As we add more individuals to our species, we use more resources. That's quite natural. The second one is what economists call gross domestic product per capita. So it's some kind of measure of the size of our economy. And so we're becoming more prosperous, the size of our economy increases, and we use more resources. So together, this creates what we could call the scale effect, right? So increasing our use of CO2. Now the good news is that there are some factors that are going to potentially offset this. The first one is what we call energy intensity. So how much energy do we need to produce every dollar in our economy, in our production system, right? And so if we can be better at this, we can offset our scale effect. So this is what we would call the technique effect. And now the last factor is what we call the carbon intensity variable or factor. It says what are the fuels, what is the energy we use to power our system, right? So if we're more reliant on fossil fuels, of course, we're going to have more CO2 emissions. But if we're less reliant, then we might be able to lower those emissions and fight climate change to a degree. So this is the composition effect. So the big question at this stage is, how are we measuring up? all right, are these technique and composition effects offsetting the scale effect. So to kind of answer the question, I compiled some data from the United Nations and the World Bank, kind of following Dr. Kaya's variables. And I started in 1990 as an entry point, as kind of the beginning of this new era of globalization, kind of transnationalization of our economies. And 22 years later, in 2011, simply because this is where the most reliable data are available here. And what we see is, so for the past 22 years, on average, every year, we've added about 2.5% to our CO2 emissions. So, all right? And a lot of that is due here to an increase in population, all right? An increase in GDP per capita, as expected, the scale effect, all right? And then what you see here towards the bottom is, in terms of energy intensity, we have a negative sign, which is good. That means we're doing a better job. And then we have the yellow cell, if you can see it here, that I want to return to in a second. So maybe to summarize that in words, it might be a little easier. So we're using energy much more efficiently than ever before. So we can pat ourselves in the back. We're doing a much better job here, and this is good. Part of the problem, however, is that this increased efficiency pales in comparison with the scale effect, our use of resources. So it's not enough to offset that. And maybe what's slightly more problematic over this period of 22 years is that what the numbers indicate is that we become more reliant upon fossil fuels rather than less over this generation or so, right? So a question I often have is, well, doesn't technology matter? Isn't technology going to solve the issue? So the answer is yes, technology matters. But the rest of the answer is no. There will not be one technology that's going to be kind of the magic bullet or the silver bullet that's going to take care of issues. So yes, we need to continue to develop technology that are going to make us more efficient in our use of fossil fuels. Technologies that are going to make us more dependent upon renewable resources. So we need to continue to do that. But what I want to emphasize now is that, in fact, a lot of the technology we may need to transition towards low-carbon societies, can fight climate change, if you want, is already here, all right? And so what we need to do, if I can think as an economist for a second here, is that we need to invest in this existing technology. So maybe the question you would have for me now is that the chance would be, okay, how much? That's a good question. I do have an answer. I'm going to use the work of the International Energy Agency that tells us, so if we were able to pool together as a world about $1 trillion every year for the next generation, so give or take 25 years, this is what things would start to look like, particularly in the electricity sector, right? So around 2030, renewable resources would become the dominant form of electricity generation. What you notice here, though, is that we would still be dependent on coal and natural gas, so two fossil fuels, all right? Which means that if we look at it in a different way, we'd be able to generate more electricity, which we'll need to do. The world is hungry for more electricity, but kind of slightly decouple that from fossil fuels, right? So that means what you see here is that the shaded area, which represents CO2 emissions, would start to plateau. So that's a good news. But what you also notice is that it's not really decreasing. That means we're continuing to emit CO2 that goes into the atmosphere that participates in global warming and climate change. So what would it take to actually decrease this shaded area and getting down towards low carbon, if not zero carbon society? So again, according to the IEA, going into this 2100, it would take another $1 trillion a year, right, to accomplish this. So at this stage, a fair question would be, but wait a second. Is $1 trillion a lot of money? After all, if we talk about, look at the climate talks last year in December in France, governments agreed to contribute about $100 billion to a climate fund over the next 5 years. So here we're saying we need 10 times that every year for the next 85 years. So yeah, that is a lot of money for an individual, any organization. It's even a lot of money for most governments, certainly. But if you put that in perspective, this is about 1.4% of world GDP. But governments, year in, year out, spend about 2.5% of world GDP on military expenditures. So if we perceive global warming, climate change as a global threat to our societies, then maybe it's a worthwhile investment, this 1.5%. Okay, fine. The next fair question is, fine, this seems reasonable, but where is the money going to come from, right? Does it grow on trees? So The joke is that if you're a central bank, it does grow on trees, but that's not the object of the talk today. So we need to find a way to actually raise those resources. So there's some good news here. The first one is that, again, year in, year out, most governments in the world spend roughly $500 billion subsidizing fossil fuels. So if we care about this transition, then this is half of the problem there. We can use these resources and direct them where they matter. So we still have short. So where are the rest of the resources going to come from? So my first argument here is that I'm not seeking to reinvent the wheel. So the argument would be that we need to do what we did, particularly in the 20th century up till the 1980s, and the development of large industrial projects like satellite telecommunication and digital computers and global positioning systems and the internet were all projects that were funded by partnerships between public sectors, the government, and the private sector, corporation, and other organizations. So we need to do that again like we did in the past. So now this is a bit not necessarily politically feasible in this stage. So if we look at the current landscape of the world economy, then maybe we can look at a different sector, right? So we look at the current financial sector. And maybe institutional investors can be a way to go. Okay, so what are those beasts? Those are the pension funds, the mutual funds, the college funds that you or your parents may have contributed to. And together they manage no less than roughly $1 quadrillion. Okay, so there's starting to be a lot of zeros. What that is $1,000 trillion in assets, right? So could we find a way for some of those assets then to be directed again towards the renewable energy sector? All right. What it will take here is something that's economically relatively cheap for governments to do, which is to really send the signals that this is a viable long-term investment. The problem is that it's not necessarily politically cheap to do. So this is then takes me to my last slide here, and is to say, so what do we need to do? Well, the first comment is that there will not be a magic bullet, a silver bullet, a solution to this via technology. But the good news is that it doesn't matter because we don't need it. Right? What we need is to care about others, to care about future generations, to care about ourselves, to demand the type of political change that will make it possible for this massive investment in renewable energy to take place today. Thank you.